I want to give Justin all the time, so I will introduce him in a minute or less, but I'll just simply say, I was reminded of this story. Actually, we were meeting before this call, and Justin asked how I had heard about the Church Politics podcast, which I started listening to probably a year and a half ago, faithfully. And I remembered that my brother-in-law, while serving as the president of the North Carolina Pediatric Society, was getting undone by all sorts of political policy that was just sort of grating against him as a doctor from both sides. And he stumbled upon this podcast that tended to slice through a lot of the politicization of everything and became a real source of strength and refreshment for him as a follower of Jesus. And so I started listening to it and had many of those same things happen to me, so much so that I got involved as a member of the AND campaign, or in the AND camp, as Justin might say, and then devoured his book, Compassion and Conviction. And his kind of tagline, if you will, is to educate and organize Christians for civic and cultural engagement that results in better representation, more just and compassionate policies, and a healthier political culture. So he has remained one of the sane voices, and there have only been a few, one of the sane voices, at least in my podcast experience over the last few months. And so I am just delighted and honored and blessed to have Justin visit with us for a bit. He's going to speak for half an hour or so. Then Ephraim's going to ask him some really hard questions just to prime the pump for you guys to have a conversation after that. And we'll go until 4:45. So Justin, thank you so much for being with us. And we're just grateful for you and your ministry.
Well, Bart, Nick, Ephraim, I appreciate the invitation. Always excited to have a conversation, to talk to Christians about civic engagement is my passion. Just kind of getting into the intersection between faith and politics is something that I really enjoy. So I'm looking forward to today's conversation. Well, I don't have to tell anybody listening today that we just got through an election, that nerves are frayed, Twitter fingers are quick and calloused, and we're still dealing with a crisis that has changed all of our lifestyles and even prevented many of us from going to church. Social media is a war zone where even Christians proclaim empty ideological rhetoric like it's the gospel, spitting buzzwords and vitriol like it's the good news. Many of us have become what I would call political scoffers. As you know, a scoffer is one who mocks and derides others. They are scornful, prideful, and arrogant. They show utter contempt for others. And when you're showing somebody contempt, you're treating them as if they're worthless, as if they're beneath consideration. Well, we should know that the Bible doesn't handle scoffers with kid gloves. In Psalm 1, it says, "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers." Proverbs 19:29 says, "Condemnation is ready for the scoffers." And if we look around today, at least on social media for sure, it seems we seem to celebrate scoffers. I'd go so far as to say some of us worship scoffers on social media, the most cynical, those who are witty with their insults and the most cutting with their disparagement of others. We watch political commentaries on certain channels because our favorite scoffers are so gifted at demeaning our opponents. But what does that say that we find so much joy in seeing that? That we joy in the humiliation of our opponents, and our elected officials and the candidates that run for office are always trying to supply us with those moments, play acting so that they can get a viral clip on social media. But see, I think that our faith should counter those impulses. In this moment, our faith should provide perspective, a foundation, and firm footing in uncertain and tumultuous times. Christian civic engagement is the art and science of applying the sacred to the secular, while not allowing the secular to become sacred. We must understand that an election like the one we just went through, win or lose, never fully determines the fate of those our civic action was intended to defend. the immigrant, the uninsured, and the unborn will still need clear-eyed and persistent advocates, regardless of who won an election. Every 4 years, we're promised our every heart's desire, and then we're left with a handful of IOUs and excuses when the people who we fawned over simply don't deliver. When will we realize that no election is ever really a decisive victory in and of itself for Christians? It's not a time to hand off the rights and concerns of those in need to the next group of ambitious politicians. We can't simply wait for others to deliver. We have to deliver. It's time for Christians to re-articulate and reapply the compassion and conviction of the gospel, and to hold those elected accountable, whether we voted for them or not, but especially if we voted for them. Will you hold Democrats accountable for the low-income housing crisis in their districts, where the poor can't even live in urban centers unless they're living on the streets? Will you hold Republicans accountable for how their healthcare policies or lack thereof have shut down rural hospitals, leaving those who are dying deaths of despair in even more desperate situations? Or will you settle for defending your party and tribe at all costs? Will you be too caught up in the fray to think critically and to avoid being a generic Republican or a generic Democrat? The AND campaign, the organization that I'm the president of, has consistently asserted that Christians are in need of a complete paradigm shift, an entirely different way of thinking when it comes to how we view and engage politics. We must re-examine and really reassess our identity and purpose in the cultural and political space. Who are we in the socio-political arena? And what have we been sent to accomplish? Not what do we want to accomplish or what do we think is in our best interest to accomplish, but what has a just and righteous God sent us to accomplish. It's okay to be in a political party. That's not my point. But Lord, have mercy on our souls if we continually allow our political engagement to be a weak, knockoff version of political conservatism or secular progressivism, a mediocre theatrical display of American pride and prejudice, where we outsource our political opinions and our social action to washed up political parties. God forbid that our civic work would continue to be an unimaginative and sloppy construct of counterfeit architecture, tailor-made in the image of the idols of the day. If we're going to be honest, many of us have a hard time delineating where our partisanship ends and where our political theology begins. If we're seeking validation from progressives, then we'll be willing to embrace a social justice with no moral anchor. That's a lesser justice. And on the other hand, if our desire is to be confirmed by conservatives, then we'll espouse a morality that lacks compassion, a perverted sense of law and order that lacks justice. But you see, Christian political engagement must be detached from the broken partisanship and mob mentality politics that are prevalent today. Our contribution can no longer perpetuate the mess that plagues our political landscape. Nehemiah 6 tells us that when Nehemiah was rebuilding the wall around Jerusalem, a group of men who had already conspired against him asked him to come down and have a conversation with them. They asked him to come down and have a meeting with them. And he responds in verse 3 by saying this: I am doing a great work. I cannot come down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and come down to you? Christian political engagement must be understood and approached in the same way, as a profound civic work, a great work. And hyperpartisanship, pettiness, and the mob mentality all amount to coming down, to descending, to stopping the work and attending to distractions that separate us from our mission. Christian politics must be more than Christian self-interest. It must be more than a hobby or this sadistic entertainment. Christian politics can't just be about waiting for the next clip of our political opponents to be humiliated. My proposition today is that political engagement for the Christian isn't primarily an occasion to pursue our preferences and financial interests, nor should it be used as a tool to settle the score with our most bitter rivals. On the contrary, Christian political engagement is a robust opportunity to love our neighbors by defending human dignity and promoting human flourishing. It's a forum for displaying the justice and moral order of a God who so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. Our public witness must be a distinctly faith-based endeavor that could only be accomplished by those who've genuinely been crucified with Christ, and as a result, are able to act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with their God. Now, I don't mean that just theoretically or in the abstract, but I mean in our daily public witness, which can be more difficult than it sounds if we really think about it. To act justly, even when our tribe urges us to abuse our power through acts of vengeance. To love mercy in the presence of bloodthirsty opponents and allies, and in the presence of those who have viciously wronged us historically. To walk humbly in a culture that promotes identity idolatry and unlimited self-expression at all costs. Our political engagement must be a profound civic work. Again, a great work. It's not to be taken lightly or used for our own frivolous purposes. Let me give you a historical example. Imagine, if you will, Frederick Douglass. Imagine Frederick Douglass preparing to debate the subject of abolition as his people continue to suffer through the dark night of American slavery. Pen in hand, memories of braided bullwhips and rusted chains running through his mind, knowing full well that as he wrote, his brothers were still being beaten like mules and his sisters were still having their babies torn from their grasp, raped and disregarded without recourse. And yet, with all these things going on in his mind, he still had to construct a cogent, constitutional, and moral case without allowing his emotions to pull him into logical fallacies. He had to articulate the pain of generations of disinherited Black souls without flinching, without sinning under the weight of his anger. This couldn't have been just a casual or haphazard undertaking. It certainly wasn't a task to be neglected or trifled with. No, it was so much more than that. It was an opportunity to knock down the gates of hell, a chance to expose the devil's dealings and to emancipate God's children and to change the world. As he shrewdly maneuvered through the halls of power, this couldn't have been just another day at the office, a leisure stroll through the civic landscape. No, it was a chance to slay giants, to bid the kingdom come, a chance to serve notice about God's will and to advocate that his will be done. How dare we waste our words trading insult for insult? How dare we allow our elected officials to waste our time tweeting instead of policy making? How dare we waste our witness paying homage to inept partisan idols? When we have people looking at us to hear what God has to say about the matter. Our public witness is a declaration of faith, a testament to the excellence of being bound to the ultimate purveyor of grace and truth. A Christian public witness confined to the limits of progressivism or conservatism is a witness squandered, a light hidden, a praise and worship chorus muted. Does our political engagement reveal the will of God? So that even if we lose a particular political battle, we've still testified. We've still borne witness. We've still shined a light into the darkness. You see, but we've allowed our political affiliations to become religious in nature. And our public witness is more opposition-centered than it is principled. You see, our partisan tribes thrive off of polarization, endearing us not through principles, but through cynicism and by cultivating fear of and disdain for our political opponents. Too many Americans have bought into the narrative that everything our political opponents do is aimed at deceiving, harming, or controlling us. Now, it would be naive to say that's never the case, but there's a serious danger in making that a constant assumption. That is mortally cynical. Because when we believe that everything coming from the other side is meant to deceive, harm, or control us, then even the most sensible directive from them becomes a ploy to unduly restrict our freedom or harm our person. Under those terms, we can't have a healthy discussion or a healthy debate. There's only room for demolition. There's only room for eliminating other opinions. We even start to find a virtue in defying the other side's every instruction or belief. If everything they do is bad, then doing the opposite must be good, right? This is what I call, I call this empty defiance. And this empty defiance invariably leads us into absurd territory because it is opposition centered and not centered around a greater principle or on something that's transcendent. And when this happens, our political positions aren't attached to a moral anchor. They're just relative to our political opponents' positions. And we seek to stake out the polar opposite end of the spectrum. This is not the fruit of faith. It actually dismantles democracy rather than building and shaping it to fit a greater objective. Christians can no longer follow parties and movements uncritically, even when they're clearly better than the alternative or committed to a good cause. You see, my point right now is that not that both sides are equivalent, but that both sides need to be corrected. But you see, it's not just the cause of a movement that matters. The spirit of the movement is also important, if not more so. It's not just the objectives or the 10-point plan of an initiative that's critical. It's the root and the foundation upon which the movement stands. The spirit of a movement will dictate what means and methods are acceptable and unacceptable. We like to think that as long as we're supporting the right cause, then we're in the right. We're the good guys if we're fighting against those that we've honestly deemed to be bad. We'd like to believe that as long as we're located on the right side of a justice or a morality issue, then everything else is just minor details of lesser concern. Well, unfortunately, that very common analysis is wrong. History, and more importantly, the Bible, teach us otherwise. A good cause is never enough. It's also the spirit of the thing that determines the righteousness or unrighteousness of the whole. The heart and ethic of an endeavor are just as important as the cause. The spirit of the thing, the guiding principles and boundaries that have been established and committed to, again, are just as important as the cause. A Christian can't simply just focus on a political victory. The posture and the path that precedes that victory must be honorable. Your posture must be upright. The path to victory must be straight and narrow. We cannot ignore the means and the methods. It's the spirit of the thing that must be tested and brought through biblical scrutiny. Now, it's quite possible and often the case that a well-intended group has embarked on a just pursuit. But even though they've embarked on a just pursuit, when adversity appears, when they get weary in well-doing, negative or destructive tactics begin to seem more expedient. Many have turned to the dark arts when faced with obstacles and impasse. Let me give you a few examples. In New York, Robert Moses, the infamous urban planner. You see, he started off as an Oxford-educated reformer fighting against corruption in Tammany Hall. But when change didn't come as quickly as his idealistic heart desired, he grew frustrated. And because the spirit of his efforts weren't properly rooted, he ended up creating an environment that treated poor people like rats, trapping them in deleterious slums and traumatizing generations of image bearers. And people all over the country copied his methods and copied his objectives. We can look at another example. Look at the folly of the moral majority. Today, a lot of people would think that movements about morality and family values are bad, but that's not necessarily the case. It was the spirit of the moral majority that became graceless, harsh, holier than thou, and full of condemnation, aligning itself with misogyny and white supremacy. That's what was destructive, not necessarily the morality and the family values. And the same thing can happen with a justice movement. If the spirit of the thing is wrong, no matter how necessary or just it may be, it will not be righteous. It will not end well. And that's why I always talk about Negro spirituals and the part and the role that they played in the civil rights movement. Because in that movement, they were always a reminder that the movement had to be upright, that it had to be aspirational, that they were doing this to glorify God, not for some humanistic objective. The right thing done the wrong way is the wrong thing. Justice brought about by unrighteousness is simply a different brand of injustice. You can't do God's work with a bitter or vengeful spirit. Now, this doesn't mean that Christians can't work with others as co-belligerents. I encourage us to work with non-believers and others as co-belligerents. But we must control the spirit of our efforts. The state of our public witness in this moment will greatly depend on if we have the faith to proceed with what I call moral imagination. Moral imagination is the ability to see not simply what has been historically or what is in the present moment, but moral imagination is the ability to see what could be in the future, what ought to be. It's hope in the midst of oppression, division, and vitriol. It's not a pipe dream. It's the Hebrew vision of the land promised, but yet to come. It's what convinced Frederick Douglass to learn how to read and write while still in chains, and when nothing in his physical line of sight indicated that he would ever be able to put his talents to use. Moral imagination is exactly what our socio-political landscape is missing today. We settle for Pyrrhic victories because we can't see past this election cycle. We trade insult for insult because we don't have the moral imagination to understand that human dignity isn't scarce, that we don't have to battle over it or hoard it for ourselves, that it's abundant and innate. Those with moral imagination refuse to lower the standard. They refuse to lower the discourse just because their opponents have chosen to wade in the mire and the muck. They have the capacity to play by the rules even when they've taken a loss at the hands of foul play. You see, it takes moral imagination not to have an opposition-centered public witness in a polarized environment. It takes moral imagination to see what the moment is hiding from you, because the moment is always hiding something from the people who are living in it. It reveals what's there, but undetected by conventional wisdom. Moral imagination prevents us from being enslaved by the moment. It enables us to participate in partisan politics without seeing the world through a partisan lens. To participate in partisan politics without allowing our political affiliation to become religious in nature, to where it controls what we believe and what we think even more than the tenets of the Bible do. Moral imagination assures us that there's more than two ways to solve a problem. And maybe most importantly, in a place like Atlanta and in a place like the Bay, Moral imagination emboldens us to uphold timeless Christian convictions, even when pop culture mocks us for it or threatens us. It reveals that there's love in inconvenient truths. Faith produces moral imagination, and moral imagination affords us the vision, aspiration, and determination necessary to build a civic space, even when the prospects of doing so seem bleak or irrational. Moral imagination gives us the capacity to see and to understand what we have in common with someone who is taunting us, with someone who is offending us. It helps us understand what we have in common with somebody who voted for the other guy. It forces us to recall that everyone has a story. Everyone has a testimony, even when their anger or their prejudices hide it from us. The civil rights movement was an exercise in moral imagination. It was the demonstration of the vision and endurance necessary to build any great work of civic architecture. It was one of the most muscular displays of democracy shaping this country has ever witnessed. It didn't overlook the present, but it wasn't limited to the present. When civil rights freedom fighters sang songs about keeping their eyes on the prize, they weren't talking about a prize that they could see physically. They were referring to a prize that had to be imagined through the lens of faith. They were describing a telos not blurred by the myopia of the present. That even when their eyes were swollen shut by batons or blinded by tear gas, they could still see the reward of a faithful and dignified public witness. And what they saw allowed them to begin to correct and shape a derelict nation. A nation that couldn't be repaired by the tools of postmodernism or the tools of rugged individualism. You see, it seems today that we really think that these ideologies are going to be what fixes our time. That the Democrat we voted for or the Republican that we voted for is going to be the thing that fixes it. But the civil rights folks knew better. They knew that your vote mattered. They knew that these things were of consequence and that nobody was necessarily equivalent, but that it was going to take more than what this world offered to fix things. We have to see that a faithful public witness is more valuable than a compromised political win. We have to understand that loving our neighbor is more important than dictating the terms. When the confetti fell and when the tears rolled, when we heard who was winning or losing elections, what was your victory in? Or what was your defeat in? Were you focused on the moment or were you focused on something much greater? Is your faith in the promises of the politicians elected or in the one who chose the elect? What is the state of your compassion and conviction after this election? Are you going to be able to evangelize to people who might have voted differently than you? Do you have the moral imagination to understand that even though you may think one side is better, a lot better, there are things that need to be corrected on that side too? There's a Christian witness that needs to be spoken to conservatives. There's a Christian witness that needs to be spoken to progressives. And do you have the boldness and vision to do that? Even when it's not invited, even when it's not welcome. Will you be bold enough to have compassion around conservatives and timeless convictions around progressives? Because that's what's going to change this conversation. Can you be a peacemaker when someone disagreed with you on an issue that is of serious consequence? On an issue that you see as a life or death issue, can you still evangelize? Can you still be a peacekeeper in those moments? How we answer that will answer how much of a good influence the church can be in this moment. God bless you and thank you for having me.
Wow. Okay, I'm supposed to come up with some questions. Well, whoo-wee. Justin Giboney, thank you so much for that presentation. That was awesome. You actually changed the questions that I had wrote down, because the first question I was going to ask you was, were you as shocked as me that Kanye West didn't win? I mean, I just figured, as crazy as 2020 has been, it deserves to be ended with Kanye West is our president. I mean, that would have just been the cherry on the top of the sundae. We just go through everything crazy in 2020, and then it ends with Heezy is president. I mean, I just thought that that'd be a great way.
That would sound about right. Yeah.
Yeah, but it didn't end that way. So you brought up some key terms that I'd love to drill down a little deeper on. And so one is oppositional. And so you brought up the point of our political engagement can be centered in who we're opposing or what we're opposing versus what we're advancing. And it seems like for the Christian, for the church, our public witness, our political engagement needs to be centered again, back on, if it's ever been truly centered that way, centered on what it is we're advancing, what it is that we're lifting up to the glory of God. So how do we get out of this captivity of centering the opposition and rediscovering what it is that truly we are called to advance as believers?
That's a great question, Ephraim. And I think it starts with this. As I said, I said that, a lot of Christians have allowed their political affiliation to become religious in nature. I know a lot of Christians, a lot of friends that I have, it seems that sometimes their Christianity becomes just a flavor of progressivism, right? Or just a flavor of conservatism, rather than being something that's very much distinct. And so what I think we have to do when it comes to politics and our civic witness is we have to have some distance between us and our political party. We have to have some distance and some distinction between us and who we may agree with most of the time when it comes to our ideology. Because if we're not able to do that, then we're unable to really critique our side of the conversation. And that's one of the biggest issues that we have, right? We're so focused on the other side and how dangerous they are. And that's what I mean by opposition centered. We center our politics about trying to stop them from doing whatever they have to do because it's the end of the world if they do that. But when you do that, instead of centering your politics on principles and the compassion and conviction of the gospel, then you're not going to look at what's wrong. You're going to allow your side to get away with murder, right? And so we always have these Christians, when I critique progressives or I critique conservatives, they're like, wait, you think there's something wrong with conservatism? You think there's some ways that conservatism might not align with the gospel? What do you mean? Or you think there's ways that progressivism might not align with the gospel? Like, absolutely. But we're so focused on the other side that we don't even, really give that a full critique. One of the things that I say all the time is that, it's to agree with progressives or conservatives all the time on every single issue is number one, it's intellectually lazy, right? It's easily manipulated, but it's not faithful, right? There are certain progressivism and conservatism are not infallible. And if we're so opposition centered that we'll go with anything that's not what those guys are over there are doing, then we're going to get fooled into a witness that is really just not biblical. And that happens all the time. We should be about social justice. But if it's a social justice where anything goes to make sure we get rid of the people that aren't for it, then that's not necessarily biblical. I would say this. I would say that, ideological conservatism and theological conservatism are not always the same thing. The secular understanding of social justice is not always aligned with a biblical understanding of social justice. So we have to be principle-centered, compassion and conviction of the gospel-centered, rather than being opposition-centered, which isn't really doesn't have a moral anchor.
Another thing that you raised, and before I say this, I just want to remind people, we're getting some already, but please, if you have questions, put those in the chat, and Bart's going to navigate through those, because we would love to be able to answer questions, address issues that that jump out at you as you heard Justin Giboney's presentation. And so we really want you to participate. Justin, another term that you brought up was identity. And so you brought that up early on in your presentation. And so the first thing that came to my mind was, oh, what if we put our identity as citizens in the kingdom of God above our citizenship or our nationalistic passions in the nation? But I didn't know if that was what you meant. And then I thought, oh, what if we put an identity of intimacy with God, an identity in Christ above our identities that come from the systems and structures and ideologies of this world. But I wasn't sure if that's what you meant. So to clarify that, so I can think the right thoughts on that, would you drill down a little deeper in what are you talking about in terms of where we should find our identity prior to our public engagement?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And what I mean by that is this, if someone says, can someone come to you and critique or even insult your political party without you getting upset? And a lot of people, they can't do that. I mean, a lot of people, if you say something about a politician they really like or say something about their political party, you've said something about them. And what that's really showing is that your identity is in that party. Your identity is in that ideology. And that's not where it should be, because at that point, people can control you from there, right? So what it should be is you should be able to come up to Justin and say, Justin, I know you're a Democrat. I have this critique or even this insult for the Democrats. And I'll be honest with you, Ephraim, I'm not going to get upset with you. I may disagree with you. I may think you're completely wrong and that your insult was, whatever ad hominem or whatever you threw out was ridiculous, but you're not talking about me. Like I don't invest myself. I don't put my identity in what the party does. That's why we're able to step back and actually render a good critique. But too often we join a movement, we get into a party, and in the book we talk about partnerships and partisanship, and our identity is in those things, but we don't take the time to really understand where though that party or that movement diverges from the gospel. And so we're so deep into it, we're so committed to this cause, right? Because I talked about causes too, that we're not focused on where the Bible should lead the cause and how we as Christians can direct that movement and be influential within that movement to make sure that it doesn't go astray. My point was that Christians can't just enter into that, put their identity into it, and just follow behind others. We have a unique and distinctive public witness, and we have to use it. Otherwise, we're just generic Democrats or generic Republicans, and we have to be more than that.
Yeah, I actually recently I was talking to a Christian brother who said to me one of the reasons he was offended and very disturbed by talk around systemic racism was he felt like whenever he heard a critique of the United States of America around race, he felt like he was being attacked personally. Or if someone was critiquing law enforcement, he felt personally critiqued because he was like, this is my country. And so that identity thing of finding yourself feeling personally attacked when someone is talking about systemic issues, whether you agree or not, you can disagree without the personal offense. I tend to be the opposite for some reason. I don't know why. Like I tend to like, I hate to admit this, but if I go somewhere and I see somebody the same color as me and they're doing something obnoxious, I go, will you stop before they blame all of us in here? Like, stop it. And so I tend to be this person, like if somebody that looks like me is doing something crazy, I feel like I need to apologize on their behalf for like the whole collective versus, so some people are like that, which is not that healthy either. And then some people are like, don't talk about my people at all, or I'm going to be mad. So don't you say nothing because those are my people. That's my tribe. That's my group. And don't you critique them at all. So if I'm evangelical, do not critique evangelicals. If I'm progressive, you can't say anything critical about progressives because I'm going to be angry. And what if people were investing more in self-critique?
Exactly.
If we kind of took the position that we all fall short of the grace of God, how about that?
I think you hit on something very important. Today, we're always trying to maintain these ironclad narratives. We've all created these perfect narratives for our group, and they're really fictional. They're not even real. And we think in order to have credibility in a conversation or have the leg up on the other side, that our narrative has to be perfect. So we don't do anything wrong. It's all them. Anything that goes wrong, somehow we've avoided it. It wasn't our fault. And what we think that helps us in the conversation, but it really kills conversation because you have no credibility. No one believes that you and your group are perfect. People outside of it know it's fictional. And the problem is neither side has credibility with the other because they're both using these fictional narratives. And what I tell Christians is you can't do that. Whether you're defending your race, your ideology, or whatever, it's not perfect. And one way for Christians to think about this is how many people in the Bible walked away from Jesus with a perfect narrative? It's hard to think of anybody that walked away with a perfect narrative because we're broken. We're fallen. You don't have a perfect narrative, but guess what? And I say this to folks in my church and other places. You don't have to have a perfect narrative to need justice. You don't have to have a perfect narrative to stand up for the unborn, right? That's not part of the conversation. So what I try to tell people is when we go into these conversations about race or about politics, let's not go into these conversations with a posture of self-defense where we're defending these perfect narratives that are really, again, mostly fictional. Let's go into these conversations with a spirit of self-examination. And when you do that, and when you're willing to admit that, yeah, we don't get everything perfect, now you bring the other person's defensives down and they can kind of admit that their narrative isn't perfect either. But Ephraim, you hit on a really important thing, which is the defense of what we see as our identity. And it really hurts us and makes us lose credibility and kills the public discourse.
Yeah, I want to ask one last question, and then I'm going to hand it to my co-host, Bart Garrett. What is it like? Well, I'm going to ask Bart one day what it's like to be a pastor in the East Bay and have the same name as light rail transportation. That's got to be awesome. But the last thing I wanted to ask you, Justin, was, when you think about this divide between conservatism and progressivism, you can always see it really strong, this divide around Martin Luther King holiday, because each side takes the same speech or the same message of Dr. Martin Luther King, but they only take the part that backs up their ideology. So conservatism would take the part of, don't judge somebody by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. And that's what conservatives will play. And then progressives will take the part where he's saying, hey, I'm coming to cash this check of insufficient funds. And I'm standing in front of this monument to President Lincoln coming to cash. And so progressives will say, that's right. This country's been fraudulent. And then the other side will say, no, this country's been great. And what's great about it is we don't really look at skin color. We look at character. So since I brought up Martin Luther King, you gave a lot of reverence in your presentation to the civil rights movement. For you, do you see the civil rights movement as the best example of public witness from the church without being hijacked or compromised by the political systems of this world?
I think it is a very strong example. Now, I don't want to romanticize it. I mean, I think it had its problems with things like respectability. I think it had its problems with women and not, putting women sometimes where they needed to be. But generally, I do think the civil rights movement and the principles that were there were just so helpful for what we're doing now. And one of the main principles that I often talk about that we don't really apply from the civil rights movement is, we know that changing systems and changing policy was really big in the civil rights movement. But there was an underlying principle that was even more important than all those things. And it was the idea that no matter how bad it got, no matter how evil that you thought your opponents were, you could never allow your opposition to have a negative impact on your spirit. You could gain all the policy that you wanted. You could win every political battle. But if you let them have a negative impact on your spirit, you lost everything. And the sad thing is today, even when we support good causes, we allow our opposition and sometimes our allies to have a negative impact on our spirit, so that even when we win, we haven't testified in a way that's biblical. Even if we change the policy, we still have not borne witness in a way that shows who we're representing and that we're doing our Father's work. And in that, I think that's where Christians really can do better. You know, a lot of folks like to quote Martin Luther King, but very few want to talk about how his life showed us that it's better to die than to hate your enemies. And we just don't get that today.
Well, Bart, I'm going to hand it back over to you, my dear brother. I know that there's a number of questions and comments in the chat, and so I'm going to hand it off to you.
Yes, thank you, Ephraim. And I have 3 teenage daughters, and I told them that the BART train was named after me for so many years, and they bought it until a few years ago. Now they don't believe it anymore. So Justin, firstly, we've got like less than 25 minutes, and I'm reading all these questions, and I'm wanting to do a deep dive in all of them. But we have a smaller group. So what I'm going to do is, I think, state the question to you and let you riff for a second, and then I'll ask the person that asked it if they wanted to follow up or clarify anything. But CJ is looking at your first question you answered on distance. Would love some concrete examples of how to demonstrate that distance between you and your party as a Christian. And I heard a lot in your answer about proper posture and character. And I'm guessing some of this question is also maybe a little bit about policy and platform. I don't want to overread it, but is there something you might say specifically there?
Yeah, I think, well, number one, and Bart, you read the book. I think the book really gets into this in depth, but I'll touch on it. I think one of the things that you can do is just make sure that you have a thorough critique of your party. You can look at the AND campaigns, message boards and all that. And anytime we critique both sides, again, you have people like, what? You really think that we're not completely along with the Bible, my ideology? But you would think it would be obvious, you know, from a biblical standpoint, that these things are not infallible. Of course, conservatism and progressivism fall short of the gospel. But have we rendered a critique? So I think if you lean left or lean right, you need to be able to list 5 to 10 things that your side is not getting right. Because what happens is, it's not that we don't hear of what they're not doing right, we just dismiss it, right? So I had someone say, you know, I bring up the point all the time that majority Christians and those who were conservative, they missed the whole civil rights movement. Like, that's a big deal. You missed the entire civil rights movement. What have you done to change that, to make sure that doesn't happen again? And someone will say, well, that was a bad period, but look at all the stuff. No. That wasn't just a bad period. Sit in that and think about what that does. On the left, you can talk about, I mean, even for Democrats in the 1990s, the late 1990s, where the Democratic Party is on abortion is extreme. And when you bring that up, somebody will automatically say, yeah, but look at what they're doing. No. Don't look at what they're doing right now. Sit in this moment and look at what's going on right now in your party. Don't move on and do the whataboutism and just kind of dismiss it. And that's really what's happened. It's not that the issues aren't serious. We're focused on something else and we prioritize something else, right? And so that's not what we're focused on. So we dismiss it because it's not our priority. And so we're not hearing one another. And I think that's one of the main things that we can do to have a full examination of both sides. And again, it doesn't mean both sides are equivalent. But I always say, if I have an infection in my right leg that's more advanced than the infection in my left leg, I still have to do something about the infection in my left leg because it'll kill me just the same. And so that's how we look at it. And that's why we think those type of critiques are critical.
Yeah. CJ, I'm going to loop back to you in just a second on that question if you want to follow up, but I want to link your second question with another question Jane George asked. You have church planters, pastors on this call with you, wanting to know what a pastor is saying from the pulpit in light of what you're talking about. And Jane kind of accentuates that question and says, you know, we're bringing biblical conviction, biblical values on justice, but is there ever an appropriate time when we should actually be talking about a candidate we're voting for or a particular position we're taking on a policy? How would you counsel pastors as preachers?
Yeah, I think those times are very rare where we would be partisan about it. right? I think there's so much that you can say and so many things that you can talk about that can lead people in a direction or have them think about it in a way to where they may make the decision that you think is right. But I think the biggest thing that pastors can do is give perspective, is give people the understanding that, look, we do have God puts things in our sphere of influence. And one of the ways that we help and change things in our sphere of influence is through the civic process. Like, that's a robust opportunity to love our neighbor, right? To make sure that they're taken care of. We need to take advantage of that, but we also need to understand that it's not an ultimate thing. And that's the biggest. I mean, I'm somebody who's I spend my life talking about faith and politics, but I still have to remember it's not an ultimate thing. And so I think that perspective and understanding of what justice really is and what it isn't, right? You may not have to tell somebody how to vote, but you can say, this is really what justice is, and this is where it can go astray. This is what moral order is, but this is why moral order has to be mixed with compassion. It has to be mixed with grace and justice. That's what these things look like. And I think those conversations are going to be more helpful and are going to apply to a variety of issues rather than telling somebody how to vote or telling them to vote for a certain person.
Yeah, that's good. CJ, do you have a quick follow-up there? Or otherwise, I'll go down to many other questions. You give me the okay sign. I'm going to skip down to one because I work with Sarah Park through Project Peace, and Sarah might be my most favorite question asker of all time. And she asked another great question here. She says, you mentioned, quote, justice wrought by the wrong spirit is not justice. And then a few minutes later, loving our neighbor is more important than dictating the terms. These sound contradictory to me, and I'm wondering what church partnership with community organizations and municipal bodies looks like when different spirits are motivating the work to realize justice in their communities. Great question.
Yeah, so you're saying that the comment about read that to me one more time. That was a good question.
Yeah.
I want to
you
make sure I get it
mentioned
right.
justice wrought by the wrong spirit is not ultimately justice. And then a few minutes later, you said loving our neighbor is more important than dictating the terms. Mm-hmm. And she's saying these sound contradictory to me. Gotcha. And so she's wondering what church partnership with community organizations and municipal bodies looks like when different spirits are motivating the work.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I would have to say about that, first of all, if we're doing justice with a completely wrong spirit, then it isn't justice. So we're not helping people, right? If we're doing something that's not holy, and again, I would ask you to read the book. If we're doing something under the name of justice that's not righteous or holy, then we're not helping people, right? And so we can say, it's not just about the semantics of it. It's about what are you actually doing? And I think the gospel demands that we have the compassion and that we have the conviction. Insofar as that goes into not always dictating the terms, the point of that is, and really that's a different context. Generally, I'm talking about kind of majority Christians and how they dictate the terms of what goes on. And what I'm saying is sometimes you just got to love people. Sometimes you just have to let people do things their way. But that doesn't mean that you condone or affirm things that aren't biblical. I think that's a big distinction there. So we don't have to necessarily dictate the terms of everything that goes on, but we cannot do something that's unbiblical. And so I think the best way to partner with other people is as co-belligerents. It's understanding what objectives that we have in common, what values we have in common, but then also understanding where those values diverge. And so that we don't get pulled into a situation where, yes, we like the cause, but it diverges into something to where we're actually hurting people. And that's what we have to see. I think people, a lot of folks who like myself and come from kind of a justice-oriented point of view don't understand that if that righteousness and holiness isn't mixed in there, then you can call it what you want, but it's not helping people at the end of the day. And some of those things, especially when we talk about progressivism, aren't immediately identifiable. Right. Sometimes it's down the road and how it has an effect on families and children. We have a very adult-centered sometimes view of justice because a lot of it has to do with self-expression. And sometimes children and families aren't included in an adult self-expression. So initially it looks good, but down the road, it's not so good. And so that's the distinction I would make. Be able to work with others. We should work with others, but never can we affirm something that's unrighteous. Because at the end of the day, we're not helping somebody, even if it's not immediately visible or, it's not immediately something that we recognize.
Sarah, you want to follow up there?
Yeah, I think I'm coming from a context of trying to mobilize fellow church members to get involved in their communities, but there's a certain fear of justice as a word unto itself, and also justice work that isn't pioneered by a Christian hand. And so I guess I'm wondering, I've seen that be a very big obstacle for folks, to let alone being involved in their communities, but also civically engaging too. So if you could, can you just provide an example of what unbiblical justice looks like on a concrete level?
Sure. I mean, I would think, that a conversation about justice that would have us affirm something that doesn't go along with the Christian sexual ethic would be a way to go about justice that isn't okay. I'll give you kind of the AND campaigns, and this is such a broader subject, but I'll give you kind of the AND campaigns understanding of that. We believe that when it comes to our LGBTQ neighbors, that they should have basic civil rights, and that Christians shouldn't have a problem doing that. Nobody should get fired from their job at FedEx because of how they identify, or not get housing because of how they identify. I think that's right. But can we go into a justice and promote things that would say children should be getting, surgeries when it comes to their sexual orientation and making those decisions? I don't think Christians can do that. And we may label that justice, and somebody would label that justice if you look at the Equality Act and things of that nature. But we would say we would actually be harming somebody in the long run if we were to go along with that. And so I think when Christians enter into those relationships with groups that would take that next step, that we're just very clear on what we support and what we don't support. Hey, when we're talking about LGBTQ issues and we're talking about basic civil rights, we're there with you all the way. When we're talking about something else, then in that case, we do somewhat have to depart. But I don't see a very good argument for just saying, hey, because you say it's justice and because you say it's good, Christians are just going to get behind it. We have to be more nuanced than that. And I think people try to compound all those things because it makes it a lot easier, but we cannot conflate what is biblical justice from things that anybody could say something is justice and put that tag on it. That doesn't mean we can support it.
Mm-hmm. Do you, well, every one of these answers and questions, I want to plumb the depths, and I have 2 follow-ups to that, but I also want to be respectful to other questions that are asked here. So Nick asked a question, and then there are a couple topics mentioned or sources and outlets mentioned underneath, but he says, so much is shaping and forming us in polarized partisanship with respect to news and media we consume. Any advice or sources for Christians to balance our news and media intake?
Yeah, I would just say read as widely as you can. You should have a favorite writer that's a progressive. You should have a favorite writer that's conservative. There's so much confirmation bias that we get pulled into thinking one way, and then it's confirmed over and over again, and we wouldn't even know if it was rational or if it was reasonable or not, because everybody that we're around is repeating that. And so I think you have to search for people. If you're around mostly people that are progressive, I think you should read people like Ross Douthat. You should read people like Yuval Levin to get some balance in what you're hearing and what you're coming into contact with. Because there are good ideas on both sides, not necessarily equivalent on one issue, but there are very good thinkers that can challenge you and help you to come up with better answers. But I think, again, this happens in a lot of big cities, when our Christianity just becomes a flavor of progressivism, when you can't really distinguish. There's been some candidates who, say that they're Christian. They say, well, how does your Christianity make you think differently at all on policy than other progressives? And you can't answer that. Well, you have to ask yourself at that point, what's actually controlling what you're thinking? Because both of those, there has to be some conflict somewhere. And the other thing that I would say is realize that people on the other side think the same thing. And so when you get upset with them for not critiquing their side, if you can't distinguish anything between you and your side, you're doing the same thing. And maybe you understand them better than you think you do.
Yeah. One of the follow-up suggestions to Nick's question was Jonathan Haidt's book, Coddling of the American Mind. I have read that book, and it does speak a lot about the lack of resiliency that many of us have in how we hold ideas today. And I'm wondering, this loops a little bit back to Sarah's follow-up question, but you talked about taking time to explore the nuance and really getting into like contextual understandings of what is biblical justice. And I totally commend and agree, and I'm excited to hear that. But at the same time, I recognize that we just don't do nuance well. And so you lose, I don't want to make this a question about cancel culture and all that gets attached to that, but you lose an audience so quickly whenever nuance is attached to anything. And so I'm just wondering, as pastors of churches, how you would counsel us to have that subtlety and nuance attached to our convictions, while recognizing that we're going to lose a hearing very quickly, often on both sides, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think you have to confirm what you can with those folks who you think you might lose. And so when I go into a conversation, I do try to confirm what I can about what they're saying. So for instance, with Sarah, I would agree that the church has some repenting to do when it comes to the LGBTQ community. That is something that we have not handled very well. It doesn't change kind of the orthodox stand and the historical stand that we've taken. And then just realize that the Holy Spirit has to work. You are there to tell the truth. You're there to bring a word. You have to take your time. You have to, do what you can to make sure that you're articulating it in a way that is speaking to your audience. But sometimes that's all you can do, and it's the Holy Spirit, and it's time. Sometimes you're planting a seed, and people are going to leave, and they're going to disagree with you. But look at the prophets. I mean, the prophets went through that all the time, and it's hard, especially when you have a church, or like me, you have an organization. And I've had people say, I don't want to hear that and get away from it. But that's the gospel. I mean, that's discipleship. You can't tickle people's ears. And so you have to address it as well as you can. And usually I try to do that by affirming what I can, but then just letting the truth be what it is.
All right. So James Westbrook, Realm Church, Oakland, great question. I love, he's taken us to the edge of your answer, which I like, but he says, what would you define as pastoral negligence when it comes to corporately pastoring the flock amidst politically charged seasons?
Yeah, I mean, I'm ordained, but I'm not a pastor. I hesitate to tell pastors what to do. I really do. I'm not one of those people.
Everyone else tells us what to do. Don't hesitate.
I come from a family of pastors, and so I'm very hesitant to tell pastors what to do. But I do try to equip and help them out, because pastors aren't experts on everything. I do think that, if there's some serious injustices going on around you and you have nothing to say about it, I think that's problematic. I think if you have minorities in your congregation that are hurting and need to hear a word about that, I think you have to try, or at least bring someone in who can speak about those things. I don't know if I would call it malpractice, because I think people are, a lot of times people are doing the best they can. But I think when you're really cold to that, or you dismiss what people are saying, then that can, that can be troubling. And I think the same thing on the other side. If people are hurting and there's an issue that they need to hear about, if you can't speak to it, bring somebody to speak to it, but don't just dismiss people. And also don't run away from the gospel. We also know that there is pressure to just say, you know what, I put my hands up, culture has gone in another direction, and I'm just not going to fight that. That's not Christian courage. And I know that
I lost a connection there. I'm sorry. I hope. Is there any way that you can recover that just in like?
It was James' question.
Okay.
Sorry about
that. I thought you didn't like it.
I'll make it shorter. Yeah, I'll make it shorter. I think, again, I was saying that I hesitate to tell pastors what to do. I'm not the person that's eager to do that, because I think pastors do their best. They're not experts on everything. I think two ways to get it wrong, though, is number one, if there's people in your congregation, let's take a racial justice, and they're hurting and they need to hear something, and for you to ignore it or to completely dismiss it and tell them not to worry about it, I do find that to be problematic. I think you have to engage it. And if you don't feel like you're equipped to do that, then to bring someone in that can engage it in a positive way. The other thing I would say is, when you get pushback on those issues that culture is pushing back on us on, and you just put your hands up and say, you know what, I'm never going to talk about it, I'm not addressing it all. That's just not Christian courage. I mean, our society makes it look courageous to do what every company is telling you to do, what every university, they're all on accord on some of these issues, but yet it's the courageous thing to go along with them. Not necessarily. Sometimes the courageous thing to do is say, no, that's not right, and stand up to do that. And so I think those are the two ways to go wrong. You got to stand up for truth, but you also have to have the compassion not to dismiss what people are hurting about. And that's probably as close as I can get to a general kind of rule.
Yeah. James, you want to follow up there? Are you good?
No, I think that's great. I just want to say thank you. And one of my best friends is Jamal Williams, man. And so,
that's my man.
Yeah, he speaks highly of you, man. But thanks a lot.
He's a great guy, man.
So we're I'm watching our time. We're close to the very end here. I want to read this question from Aaron Putnam. He says, a faithful Christian public witness is often viewed solely in terms of our public statements, either spoken or written. Can you expand on the role of compassionate listening for understanding listening for understanding in our public witness as Christians?
We got to hear people out. I mean, we have a system, if you think about it, we have a variety of opinions and stances on a lot of issues, and those are crushed into two groups, right? Republicans and Democrats generally. And so you have a lot of nuance in there. We have to sit down and listen to people. Like I said before, and this is something people get me on, I think the church has done a terrible job, especially majority church, when it comes to race. No doubt about it. It has to do better when it comes to race. But guess what? Even somebody who gets race wrong, that does not define their whole person, right? People are bigger than that. So if we don't sit down and listen to people and understand their experiences and understand that these people are dying of deaths of despair and they're committing suicide and they're ODing and they don't see any hope and they've been given this as a scapegoat, but we've got to be there to understand that. Otherwise, what is grace for? Grace isn't just for the things that are easy for us to talk about. It's not for the stuff that we feel that we're justified in. It's for the hard stuff that we don't understand why somebody would think like that. That's what grace is about. And so I think in these conversations, we have to build relationships. We cannot cut somebody off and go along with, hey, you say something I don't like. Well, that's violence. You disagreed with me. I'm out of here. Don't put up with abuse, but don't have an expansive definition of what violence is, so much so that you just get to cut off people that you don't agree with or you don't want to hear what they have to say. And so I just say, hear people out, try to understand where they're coming from. You can disagree with them, but if Christianity is about that grace, then you got to show that grace to everybody and realize that it's not always about you, because we tend to center ourselves and our feelings when we really need to be thinking about other people.